The topic that I've chosen is a very close to my heart and which I'm working for last more than 20 years. That is ichnology. It's an effective tool to investigate sedimentary deposition environment. So I am working in this field since 1999, and I have worked in several places. So what is ichnology? It's a relatively very small part of paleontology. This is my outline of the presentation. First, I'll talk about what is ichnology, how to identify trace fossils, how to identify trace fossils and pseudofossils, that is not correct fossils, and then we will take up some techniques of identifying sedimentary environment with the help of trace fossils and few case studies. So first thing first, where does ichnology fits in? Now, ichnology is a branch of paleontology in which we don't have any evidences of body fossil present. The only way in which we could understand about the animal and their paleontology or their life form is the imprints that they leave in the sedimentary domain. So you have this whole division is called as trace fossils or ichnology. You can have an invertebrate ichnology or a vertebrate ichnology or a human ichnology. For example, this is more like a forensic studies. Okay, what you do, what you understand after the scene has been created. For example, if I'm walking on a beach, okay, by the footstep only I could understand or I could analyze what is the height of my body, what is the weight, how fast I was going, whether I was running or I was walking, or in which direction I was moving. So all this information I could easily pick up looking at only the footprints that I'm leaving on the coastal area or soft sediment. So similarly, we also work in understanding what animal may leave what kind of footprint. So this is a very broad science which deals with animal and plant traces. So ichnofossils or the fossils or the trace fossils, what we call it, are biologically produced sedimentary structure that includes track, trail, burrow, boring, fecal pellets, and they record the behavior also of the animal at very spot, okay, where they lived millions of years. Now, how do they record behavior? For example, suppose I'm a human being, I have walked on a sea coast, I have left my footprint behind. So depending on the size and the preservation of footprint, anybody could understand whether I was running or I was walking. So this behavior also we can understand of the animal. So I'll give you a very small example. Let us look at this photograph. It is very difficult to see a very small crab here. It's a very tiny crab known as Ossipoda platyris. It is better seen here, a very small crab. But see, in just 180 seconds, it is able to modify so much of sand. Okay, if you can take the size of this crab and the size of this sediment that it is disturbing, it is able to disturb more than its size. Let me give you another example. This is a very famous case. Now imagine ants. We see ants everywhere, but we never cared of how much disturbance they can create subsurface. So few of the scientists, they in Argentina, they try to flood this ant burrows with cement. And what they found out was this entire burrow was flooded with 6.7 metric ton of cement mixed with 9,000 liters of water. And this is a whole mega city that you can see it was excavated. So just imagine what the smaller invertebrate animals are capable of. Now the question is, if we are able to properly study this, we could understand how they were living, in which conditions they were living, and On the top of it, we can also understand what is the success story behind their cultural or their evolution. So this is what iconology does. So before coming to this iconology, first thing that we should understand is what are actual imprints left by an animal and what are not imprints left by animal. Okay, so what are the physical thing and what are the biological imprints? So there are certain criteria. For example, if you look at non-biogenic structure, okay, non-biogenic means they don't have any biological origin, like mud cracks. They are inorganic sedimentary structure. The first thing that we should learn in this is to correctly identify what kind of, whether we are looking at a trace fossil or we are looking at the biogenic structure. So non-biogenic structure have certain characteristics. They are inorganic, they have secondary diagenetic feature, the dimension is variable, they are non-uniform in size and shape, they have irregular geometric pattern, very strict preferred orientation, and there is a mineral replacement. So if you try to find this, then you will be able to distinguish between a trace fossil and a non-biogenic structure. On other hand, a trace fossil would resemble a body part or a body of an organism. It will have uniform size. It will have current alignment. It will have a regular geometric pattern. It will have burrows, lining, spherite, meniscated fill, organic residue, and very delicate morphology on their surface. So this is one of the very key factor in distinguishing the trace fossil and non-biogenic structure. Now let me give you some examples of non-biogenic structure. See where this problem comes. This problem comes when we are interpreting depositional environment in a very unique situation. Like for example, we are understanding sedimentary environment of Precambrian rock. Then this becomes very critical, because there first of all animal origin was less, or animal or the organisms were in very less quantity, and there were a lot of non-biogenic structure. So to avoid this, in Precambrian we should be specifically, any structure can be a tool marks, like for example ammonite, which is dead and it is rolling over this, and then what you see, they will form this feature. Okay, these are known as tool mark. Or even in glacial environment, when a large boulder is dragged along the floor of the glacier, it leaves certain mark. But remember, what are our earlier characteristics? Non-uniform size and shape, irregular geometric pattern. Non-uniform, see here somewhere it is thick, it is thin. So these are of non-biogenic origin. Second, you may find lot of this kind of structure, okay, which are of not biogenic origin actually. They are formed like this, okay. Most of them are mats, algal mats, which are uplifted by the gases that are formed in subsurface. So, second, you may have mud cracks which are preserved, like a case study here. These are all mud cracks, okay. Now, how do we identify whether it is a mud crack or it is a trace fossil? The first thing is that if you see very carefully, the dimensions are not uniform. It is tapering out, okay, like this. So these are the first few criteria to identify what are pseudofossils and what are actual trace fossils. Now, how do we work? Okay, we work in various areas. This is a more field extensive study. And from the field, we have two things. Either you work on outcrops or you can work on laboratory. The laboratory work is restricted to more like a petroleum industry. Now remember, in petroleum industry, we take out core and we study this cores for its geological modeling. Here, trace fossils are one of the most important tool, because before cutting those core, only if I can visually see and I can identify trace fossils, there are a lot of information I could have beforehand. So these are the various ways in which ichnologists work. Now, how do we take help of ichnology in understanding depositional environment? This is the main criteria that we have to come. So what we have done till now is we have understood what are trace fossils, what are not trace fossils. Okay. Now we will see some of the principles. So before using this tool as a for sedimentary deposition environment, we must understand few principles. First principle is like our body fossils. Okay, we use body fossils for recreating biostratigraphy. Unfortunately, we cannot use trace fossils to recreate biostratigraphy. It is because they have a very long temporal ranges. Okay. Second, most of the trace fossil are facies dependent, and they are very common in those rocks which are supposed to be unfossiliferous. So if you are looking at many of the unfossiliferous rocks where you won't find any body fossil, but the trace fossil would be there. And this is one of the main reasons why ichnology has become a very important aspect for studying Precambrian sedimentary environment, because this is a very good, well preserved in those sections. Second is you do not have causative organisms, like the causative organism is not preserved. And it is said that one animal can create multiple structures or different structures, okay, where their behavior may be different. Second, they can be vice versa. Different animals can produce a similar kind of structure. For example, you are looking at a trace fossil which is known as Ophiomorpha here. Now this Ophiomorpha can be created by a crab, by a shrimp, or by some other organisms if they show similar kind of behavior. But apart from this, what makes them so unique are this. Now, like body fossil, where they can be easily displaced, like you take example of bivalve shell, it can be easily displaced from its origin of where it was formed, okay, or where it was deposited, and therefore they undergo several changes. But trace fossils cannot move from the place. So say no, there is no secondary displacement is observed. Biogenic are preserved intact, and this quality make it so unique that it is one of the most preferred tool for interpreting deposition environment. Second is there are multiple architecture can be produced in a composite burrow. This is a kind of composite burrow we are looking. Okay, and so these are some of the principles that are there for using them as a tool. So most important are the no secondary displacement, okay, and then same can be made by different animal with same behavior can make them. Trace fossils are common in rock record, otherwise which are unfossiliferous. Now I'll just show you, I'll just stop for a minute and show you this photograph. Now look at this track. It looks like made by a very confused person. Okay. Now this track was made by this organism which is lying here. This is known as Oretoscula striata. And to make it more interesting, look at the date on which these photographs were made. I had taken this photograph when I was doing my PhD from Mandvi Beach in Kutch on 26 January 2001 around 9 AM in the morning. If you can recollect, this was soon after the earthquake. Just the earthquake has struck Kutch around 8:44 AM, and then luckily I was there and I could take this photograph. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, in rock record, suppose I'm getting this, okay, I can not only understand my sedimentary environment, but I could also delineate some of the earthquakes which has been preserved, okay, in the rock record. So this is a very beautiful photograph showing. Now, what happened with this animal? This used to stay in the burrow. This is the burrow of the animal. It used to stay inside the burrow. And when the earth started shaking, okay, it also felt that earthquake, and it came up on the surface, and it got so confused that it circulated, or it went around its burrow, and ultimately it died. So this kind of behavior is also documented in rock record. So point number one, with this trace fossils, we could understand sedimentary environment. With the same trace fossils, we can also understand the behavior of the animals. So this is kind of a very effective tool, not only to understand sedimentary environment, but also understand the evolution. But for today's lecture, I will restrict myself to how to use them to know the sedimentary environment. Now, when you take a very close-up look at the modern sea beach or an intertidal zone, what we see are this kind of small pellets. Okay. Now, these small pellets, what are they doing? There are a lot of crabs, lot of animals. What they are doing is they are disturbing the sedimentary fabric. So they are either rearranging the sedimentary fabric, or they are manipulating the sedimentary fabric. So this is like, and they are selectively removing certain thing. For example, if a wave comes and it deposits a sediment layer, it will also have organic matter. But with this kind of bioturbation, they are removing that organic matter. Second thing that happen is they try to collate or they try to take out the clay material from the suspended part and try to put that clay in the sand. So these kind of modifications they are constantly doing in various environments. This is a photograph just to show the intertidal environment. Next is, this is just a general, I will just introduce what it is. So trace fossil, they do indicate different behavior. Now we ichnologists have categorized behavior into more like 8 categories. One is resting trace, other is escape trace, dwelling trace, feeding. Then feeding, there are 2 kinds of feeding. One is where they make some bacterial growth in their burrow and they feed on that bacteria or algal matter, and other is the organic matter. What we saw here, this organic matter, these, the upper 2 photographs are of the feeding strategy. And they can also have predation. Predation means they attack any other animal and then they eat that animal, like more like a hunting in vertebrate. Grazing trace and then crawling trace. So by looking at the trace fossil morphology, we can easily understand what kind of behavioral strategy that particular animal was adopting. For example, if I find a trace fossil of a starfish, okay, it would mean that it was a resting trace. Otherwise, if it is a crawling, that you cannot get this kind of perfect shape. Okay, so these kind of behavior we can interpret. How they are preserved is another thing. Usually they are preserved in various categories. What we call them is a epirelief, means it occurs on the top of the bed. Hyporelief means at the bottom of the bed they are preserved. and in between the bed they are known as, again it is a part of epirelief. So what happens under the bed, this below bed is also having some crawling press, it gets imprinted over this. So you have this different terminologies here. I won't go into detail. So they have different classification. We have Silaker classification and Martinson classification. We call it as full relief for the entire burrow which is well preserved, semi-relief or where the half of the things are there. Okay. Now, we come to our main aspect, that is how to use this information on trace fossil to interpret the sedimentary environment. The first question that comes to mind is on what level you want to identify this sedimentary environment. What level, in the sense whether you want to just know that whether it is a deltaic system or a fluvial system or an intertidal bar, that's it. Or you want to exactly know in a beach or in a deltaic environment what processes were responsible for that. For example, whether hydrodynamic condition was fluctuating, whether the salinity of the deltaic environment was fluctuating, or there was oxygenation was less. So what resolution you want to work in depositional environment. Based on this resolution, there are two techniques or common techniques are available. One is ichnofacius technique and other is ichnofabric technique. We'll see one by one. See, both technique, they have their own advantages and disadvantages. It depends on what aspects you want to study. Suppose I am working in a very huge basin. I want to know that what were the major deposition environment responsible for this sandstone. Then my interpretation is on a very broad scale. Then I will use ichnofacius technique. But if I'm working in a very small area on a very specific sub-environment, and I want to know how the hydrodynamic has changed, whether there was any salinity variation at that time or oxygenation deficiency at that time, whether it was cyclic or non-cyclic, this can be understood by ichnofabric. Now, first I will talk about ichnofacius and then I will go to the ichnofabric. Now, Adolf Silaker was a scientist who developed this ichnology. He is considered as a father of ichnology. He was basically a German and he has extensively worked in Pakistan region where he developed his some of the ichnological concepts, and he also extensively worked on the North Sea tidal flats. Now what his concept was, you have trace fossil. Now trace fossil are result of behavior of animals. Animal behavior is dependent on environment in which it is living. For example, if we take of our example, okay, like suppose I am staying in a very stressful environment, like in office or everywhere, what will happen? My behavior will change. I will be more aggressive, I will be more frustrated. And then what will happen? It will be reflected on the impact or the imprints that I leave. Similar thing also happens with the invertebrate animals. So what Silaker gave is a very classical study of the linkage between trace fossil behavior and environment. What he said, environment means what? It includes lot of ecological control, which is the sedimentation rate, substrate, whether the substrate is a hard or it is a soft, salinity variation, oxygen level in the water, the turbidity in the sense how turbid the water is, light penetration, temperature and water. 8 major factors controls this environment. If any one of them changes, the behavior of those community of animals will change, and that would be reflected in crest fossil. The best example is, let us look at the food resource. Okay, that is the organic matter availability. Now, in a shallow marine environment, when we come to shore face environment, where your waves are building up, they are colliding with the foreshore environment. What happens? Your water is already agitated, so it is turbid. Okay, and your substrate is of a loose sediment. Now, in this condition, you can imagine the hydrodynamic condition. Your organic matter, which is a very fine-grained element, it cannot suspend on the substrate. It will be always floating in the water column. On other hand, if you go below wave base, since that agitation of water is not there, all my fine organic matter will settle on the sediment. Now, what does it do? If I take one example of an polychaete worm, which is an annelid worm, it has a habit of taking food from the water column. Okay, it has a special appendages through which the water flows, and those appendages, they filter the organic matter and then they eat. So what will happen if we put that same worm in this two environment? That worm won't survive in this, okay, where it is already settled. Okay, so its behavior has changed, environment change, behavior change. It will go away from there, but it will successfully in this environment. That is the Scolithos environment. Why? Because the food availability is there. So what happens as your environment changes, the behavior will change. The behavior change, the animal would change, and this gives you a series of echinofacies. Okay, so originally in 1967, Silaker gave 8 echinofacies model, okay, and he roughly correlated with the bathymetric depth or the bathymetry. Although his bathymetry is not, but more or less it follows the same bathymetry. Bathymetry in the relative sense, not in the actual sense. So what he did, he identified that Psilonicnus scolithos are those kind of echinofacies which are very common on shore face environment. But as you go deeper into the ocean, it is replaced by Cruziana, then by Zooficus and Nerites. Now, what does it mean? So I have a complete range from Psilonicnus scolithos, Cruziana, Zooficus to Neritus. Neritus occurs in very deep abyssal zone. Zooficus in the bathyl zone, but in the shallower area, it is Cruziana, Scolithos, Psilonicnus. This means that the animal community is changing, their behavior has changed, okay, and there are a lot of other implications. So in this Silaker model, if we want to take this and use it in our identifying sedimentary environment, we have to look for these assemblages. So suppose I'm finding in a sandstone, fine-grained sandstone, lot of this kind of, or lot of neritic kind of crest fossil, then I can easily interpret that this rock was deposited in a relatively deeper environment, that is abyssal zone. Okay, so this is way in which it works. And then on the other hand, he also categorized 3 more categories based on the substrate. Substrate means whether it was a rocky or a very firm rock, and he identified Tripentis. Tripentis occurs on the rocky coast. Pteridolites, that is occurs in the woody or xylic matter, that is basically plant fossil. And then glossy fungi, it's a semi-consolidated structure. Now since then, a lot of research has gone, and now what you have is so many of ichnofishes are available. Okay, most of the diversification has occurred in the fluvial area. So as during Silaca's 1967 time, it was assumed that fluvial or the river sediments are having very little trace fossil, or there are no much animals there. But later on, we found that those are also equally diverse. So you have a lot of different animals which make their burrows in those, and that is why this diversification happened in the river. So with the addition of this, now you have almost like 16 ichnofishes developed to identify various sub-environment of the system. Okay. Now here you can also identify in a river system whether you were on the bank side or a channel side. Now let me do one thing. I'll explain some of these classical ichnofishes because we have very limited time. I'll just show you the highlight of them. So this is Tripentys ichnofishes. Tripentys means the rock record is there. It's already rock, and the animal have capability to drill that rock either by applying certain chemicals or by crushing that rock. Okay, so it produces very unique structure, and this is known as Tripentys ichnofishes. This is very common in carbonate areas or carbonate rock records, especially if you go in the middle central part of India. Our bark beds have extensive Tripentys ichnofishes. Then you have peridolite. Now these are borings which are formed on the wood or the tree logs. They are this kind of very peculiar shape borings. They occur in very assemblage and not singular, but lot of them are there, and their wall is ornamented. So this is a typical wood substrate. Okay, and then you have a glossifungite ichnofishes. Glossifungite means your soft sediment, they have changed to a firm ground. I'll give you an example. Like suppose whenever we are walking in an intertidal zone or a seashore, sometimes our foot goes down, okay, but sometimes it is very firm. So this firm is this glossifungite ichnofishes where it happens. Now why this is separated is because those animals which have adapted, which have very soft skin to live in the soft sediment, once this becomes dewatered, they won't be able to live here. Another example is mud or very fine grained area where like a delta, you have pro-delta mud is being deposited. In those cases where those mud has become lithified, it becomes very hard, okay, almost like a shell. Then once the substrate has changed, the original animal won't live there, they will have a different set of animals. So they have this different fishes. Next is Pseudonychnus and Scolithos. Essential thing here is all the burrows are vertical, dominantly vertical. Okay, in Scolithos, they are either single or U shape, okay, or sometimes very long vertical axis. But in Pseudonychnus, it is more like a U, Y, and I shape, like Y, okay, like this. But both of them indicate one thing, okay, they are formed under the shallow marine conditions, especially in the high energy condition of the intertidal zone, foreshore area. As you go in deep, it is replaced by Cruziana ichnofishes. Now this is very unique because this has more horizontal burrows than vertical burrows, but vertical burrows are also here. Here in Scolithos, you have 99% of the burrows would be vertical burrows. Here 80% would be horizontal, 20% would be vertical. Okay, So this is kind of mixed environment. This happens in the sublittoral or where below your wave base or around your wave base. This is very common. Then we have Zoophicus echinofacius, very famous. Zoophicus occurs in very quiet environment where sedimentation rate is very low. Special case is a shelf environment. So in shelf environment, when you know that sediment rarely comes, they only come when you have a very extensive storm conditions, they bring the sand. Otherwise, it's only mud that is settling. So in that case, you will have Zoophicus. And then in deeper environment, especially like turbidite environment or deep sea environment, you will have this complex geometry of the trace fossils. Now one may ask, why such complex? The complexity of this is because, one, they have adopted different strategies to exploit that limited resources. Imagine 3 kilometers down deep in the sea, we have light is less, pressure is more, temperature is this, and organic matter is very minimum. Hardly some percent organic matter is there. And in that condition, when the animals exploit it, he need to better exploit it so that the maximum resource he could exploit. And therefore, they have adopted a strategy by which they could explore or exploit this in a very efficient way. For example, if I have a block of this area, okay, now if we'll take an example of a mineral resource, if this block of area is having a lot of good mineral, what you'll do, you will make this one and you will exploit. But if the mineral resource is really very less and very precious, then what you'll do, you'll make it more extensive. So you'll try to exploit everything, okay, in a specific pattern that you will be able to exploit that. And that is the reason when you go deeper, you have more complex geometry available. So from this vertical to mixed environment to only horizontal environment and this kind of complex, you have a series of trace fossils which give a very good indicator of this deposition environment. Okay. Now this technique of Xylacus echinofacius model, it works well with when you want to work with larger deposition environment. But this doesn't give me idea that how much hydrodynamic condition have changed, whether the salinity has changed or it was fluctuating. Everything is possible when we go at echinofabric level. So this is a second technique. So basically echinofabric, it works in both ways. It takes the good aspect of echinofacius and it takes good aspect of sedimentology. It mixes them and then give a understanding. Now what happens here is it takes into account primary sedimentology, ichnology, burrow size, degree of bioturbation, and tiering. Tiering means at what level animal is suitable to live. I can give a better example for this. Like when we as a faculty, we are teaching to a class, there are certain students who will prefer to sit at the last bench. There would be some set of students who would prefer to sit on the first bench of the class. Now what is this? This is tiering. Similar way, an animal, it prefers to exploit deeper resources or it tries to exploit the top resources. Okay. So this gives a very good idea about the echinofabric. Now, take an example of this. These are small, this is a U-shaped burrow is there, lot of trace fossils are there. Okay. Now you can see that this is one unit, this is second unit, this is third unit. What is happening here? Okay. Here you have an escape structure. That means animal was trying to escape. When this happen, when this behavior happen, when you have a very high rate of sedimentation. Okay. But just below it, you have a lot of U-shaped structure, feeding structure, means the rate of sedimentation was moderate. Now you see from the ichnophaseous deposition larger scale, we are coming to a very smaller scale where we are trying to understand centimeter scale of variations. So this is hardly 50 centimeter sediment, but I'm able to understand 3 events very precisely. Okay, I have a pause plane here, I have a moderate rate of sedimentation, I have a high rate of sedimentation. So this is the thing what it works. So ichnofabric analysis, it creates stacking pattern of ichnological and sedimentological data. It uses paleoecological changes. Salinity variations are understood. Okay. It also records strategic important shift. And when it is tied up with chronostratigraphy, suppose you are able to pick up the biostratigraphic material from here and here, you will be very precise in telling, okay, at what age the high rate of sedimentation was there and what age the low rate of sedimentation was there. And therefore, this combined studies of ichnofabric and ichnofacies is nowadays extensively used in sequence stratigraphy also. So how do we study ichnofabric? Studying ichnofabric works in a very simple way. You have to understand with reference to physical sedimentary and structures, how many of this original physical sedimentary structures are disturbed. Okay, so there are workers like Dodson and Bodger, okay, or there are other workers who have created this kind of visual estimate. Now, in a 1 meter by 1 meter scale, if I am able to see all physical sedimentary structure, okay, and no biogenic structure, that means my ichnofabric is 0 or ichnofabric indices. I'll call it as ichnofabric, or bioturbational indices is 0%, 0% bioturbation. On the other hand, you have, I am unable to see any physical sedimentary structure. That means it has completely been destroyed by animal. So this is 100% bioturbation. In between, I have various scales. So I'll call it as II1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 is complete homogenization. Okay. So you can use this visual chart. 1. Okay. Second is you can compare the visual chart of the overlying sediment and underlying sediment. Underlying, I am having this indices 1, but overlying is ichnofabric indices 6. What it will mean? It will mean that here my energy condition was very high. It was not suitable for any organic or animals to survive. And then it was, the overlying sediment was very good, lot of organic matter. So these kind of micro things we can interpret. Second aspect of this is understanding the tire position. Okay, this is a very good thing. It gives you what animal, what succession of animal it came, which animal preferred deeper strata, which animal preferred the shallower strata. So this gives a very good insight into the ichnofabric. Yeah, this one. But of course, this works on a very microscopic scale. Okay, or a very smaller this one, high resolution scale. And therefore, with this technique, we are able to understand the oxygenation variation, the salinity variation in an environment. We will wait for the intensively develop. And it has a peculiar, what do you call? It has a peculiar black, dark color shale, which is extensive. This is a kind of source rock. Now, many scientists, they have worked, and when they mapped this, they found a lot of this kind of sedimentary environment. Okay, soft sedimentary deformation structure, this, okay, and then based on sedimentary environment, they try to interpret that this can be a deep sea submarine fan. Now, having said deep sea submarine fan, it creates two problems. One, you're expecting a deep sea marine fan in a very shallower part of the basin, and then your iconology should also support. So with this, when we start looking, what we find is we do not find any of this. So we should have typically Neritis or Zoophagous ichnophases. But most of the ichnophases were either Scolithos or Cruziana ichnophases model. Okay, so you can see here, Gyrolith, Diplocriterion, okay, this kind of thing. So these led to a series of studies where we could identify that this whole soft sedimentary deformation was delta front collapse, which lead to soft sedimentary deformation. We understood with the more analysis of the shale, where you can see organic matter also here, and the type of trace fossil which is there. Now, if you see this photograph, this is a sandstone, this is a shale. Now, this shale is hardly a few centimeters, but it has this trace fossil which are known as gyrolith. They form when the salinity is reduced. In a normal marine setting, when the salinity reduced, you have gyroliths. So now I know that there was some salinity variation. It supports my delta environment. And then a lot of other things also work. A lot of Ophiomorpha into this. It was like a more Ophiomorpha. Similarly, you have a lot of escape structure, your different type of this one. So what it concludes that it was a deltaic system, which was a river dominated delta. And then what helped us is the iconology or the icono-assemblage and icono-fabric of this rock. It helps in understanding that. And you can see more of this. I'll take a second example of deep sea core. This is courtesy IODP core repository taken from Indian Ocean. If you take a deep sea core, you can see a lot of this kind of structure. Okay, these are trace fossils called as Zoophagous chondrites. Okay, and this were deposited in a very deep bathyal condition, where chondrite indicate restricted oxygenation condition, and Zoophagous again tell you about the very low sedimentation rate. So this, what we were able to identify that here oxidation was very good during this time. It became anoxic, and then again it became oxic, anoxic. So this hardly 20 to 30 centimeter of sediment core from deep sea Indus fan, it gives me a precise variation in oxygenation cycle. Okay. Now it's better. What I'm saying is it's look very simple, but you have to actually analyze here. The main trick is, see, the dark color means the organic matter is well preserved, and light color means it has been oxygenated. So when you have this kind of mottling, that is in the dark background you have white color, this one, it means that it has been come from there. So this kind of thing, it helps in understanding oxic and anoxic cycle in deep sea also. Lastly, I'll take another example from Crimea, that is the Bajocian Bakark Basin. Crimea is situated on the northern side of Turkey around this Black Sea, and this is Crimea. This is a study from this. We have been studying this part all along this area, and what we found was this is actual, and you can see this is ammonites, and whole sediments look like this, but very careful examination of the sediment, it gives us, okay, how the bioturbation has varied, what are the key factors here, okay, trace fossils here, and how they are distributed in shallow tire, middle tire, deep tire. And you can see some of the example. This is a chondrite, this one, and what we found out that in a bed, this is a bed boundary, this is a top of bed boundary. Okay, some of the trace fossil are here, some of the trace fossil are here. This means this is the deeper trace fossil, these are middle trace fossil. And based on this, like this, we can say that there were a lot of cyclic variation in the oxygenation condition and the restriction condition. Oxygenation varied during the back arc process, and then whole community also got adapted to it. Okay, and they tried to change or adapt by changing certain parameters. So the whole composition of community, it tried to change. So with this, I come to an end, and then we will take up our question answer. Okay, so these were 3 case studies of this. Fine.
Hello, sir. So there is a question in chat box.
Yes.
I will read you the question. To what extent iconology is useful in Proterozoic sediments when life was in initial stage?
Okay. Now, yeah, I will take an example of Vindhyan. Now, if you are working in Vindhyan, you will come to know that one of the largest or most prominent discovery about the earliest life happened from Vindhyan sediment. It is near the Rampur area or the Chitrakoot area, that side, where the most primitive burrow from the Mesoproterozoic, it was discovered by a group of people from our India, and then it was confirmed by Adolf Seilacher. This review or this work appeared in journal Science. But the second aspect is, in Mesoproterozoic it is very important, but in Neoproterozoic it becomes more important, because when you are establishing that Ediacaran and Cambrian boundary, this became most important. Why? Because across this boundary you get a very drastic difference of trace fossils. So in Cambrian you start getting all trilobite trace fossils, but here you don't have any trilobite trace fossils. So yes, they are very important, but in Neoproterozoic they are very critical. Mesoproterozoic, they are important as a evolutionary data bank.
Okay, sir. So there is one more thing. What is minimum diameter of burrow structure? Like, is it diameter related? Any inference?
Yes, diameter is, it gives the information regarding the size of the body fossil. Okay.
Yes.
It is a worm. You cannot expect 1 meter diameter burrow. It has to be of that shape. So it is roughly correlatable with the body size of the trace maker.
So someone is asking how iconology helps to identify economic mineral deposits in particular environment. Of course, like it's related to petroleum and all.
See, economic mineral, okay. Now I'll explain in a different way. Now, when you're looking for economic mineral deposit, like take example of coal. Okay. For identifying or discovering coal, you require a certain particular type of environment. Now, suppose you're mapping a basin and you have identified certain sub-environment or environment, you will, if you go across the deep across the basin, you will automatically know that what environmental changes would happen. So it does give a very broad picture of how in a downstream side of what you're mapping and upstream side you're mapping, what facies change you expect. So any facies related economic mineral deposit can be identified by this. It is also it is not about finding an economic mineral directly, but identifying an environment which is suitable for that mineral to occur.
Yes, sir. Well, we don't have any further questions here.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Your extensive lecture clearly shows that you have done a lot of work in iconology.
Thank you.
And we are really amazed to see the information we can actually get from iconology. sort of things were very interesting and appealing, and very new to us too.
Yes, yes. Because it's a very limited, not many people are working in paleontology.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
That's right.
Okay. Anyway, thank you everyone. Thank you for joining.